Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the seventh part of the Chronicles of Gabriel, the interview with the exorcist series that to me is so fascinating considering that I've known Dr. Douglas Gabriel for 45, 50 years, and I'm finding out all kinds of things that I didn't know. So I hope you find this as engaging as I do. And so in this particular episode, I'm going to let Douglas just lead us into the thicket and we'll see what we find there. And so here we are in Detroit. And my name is John Barnwell, and I'm here with Dr. Douglas Gabriel. Good morning. Good
Good morning,
afternoon.
John. Oh, yes. Well, it's timeless here on the internet. Yes, good, whatever. Yeah, I just want to make a couple remarks about the comments we've been getting in the different places that this is posted. I started this whole thing off with great trepidation, thinking that it wasn't a good idea necessarily, because these aren't necessarily pleasant topics. And that's the reason that I don't smile much when I'm doing these, because I'm not really telling jokes. I'm unfortunately revealing all kinds of things that are stirring up people because they're saying, well, I had similar experiences and this and that, and I was there, and and it's just amazing to me who is out there listening and the wonderful responses people have given. Today, I'm going to talk about going down to Assumption Abbey, and here a person I've known on Facebook for some time says, well, I've been to Assumption Abbey and I went to the cave. I must be the caves you're talking about. And I meditated there for 3 days and had an illuminating experience. I'm like, what? There's other people. And now the caves at Assumption Abbey are literally not the ones that the one I particularly like, but there's like two or three of them that are in pictures there for people to look at. It's like, how is this now? Everything's out. So this has been cathartic. It's a great catharsis for me to go back and say, "Ooh, can I say Father Cyprian's name? If he's still alive, I'm not going to say his name. Well, he's no longer alive." Same thing, with Father William or any of these people I'm talking about. So if I mention their name, it's only because I believe that it wouldn't harm anyone. But otherwise, I'll just make a general reference to a lot of these things. But yes, John, this is, I'm going to give it a little quick encapsulation. Um, I've been kicked out and rejected by so many different places. Like I didn't like my uh, dad, my home life. I didn't want to stay in the Catholic Church, so I kept moving on. I didn't want to stay in the college, so I moved on and went to the military. I didn't like that. I really hated the violent, aggressive nature of the military. And then working in signal intelligence, I went in to get an experience with machines. I ended up hating machines, and I still do to this very day. And then what happened at the end of that time, I got introduced to the craziest machines you can, Reich boxes and all kinds of orgone energy boxes and radionics boxes and radiesthesia, this and that. And then I end up telling the story of, basically George Delaware's attempt to be able to use radionics to go between uh, beyond space and time. And that, I guess, got people all stirred up, the whole looking glass thing. So it was as equally disturbing to me as I was going through it, and but I was very young and naive, and a lot of these things I didn't fully understand until now. Literally, reflecting back on them after decades and decades, I look at this stuff and say, "Wow!" So today we're going to talk about basically what people really can't quite understand when they ask me questions about my life, and I tell them the degrees that I have, and they say, "No, you can't have all those degrees." And then they would take out a piece of paper and start asking me specific detail. "Well, and what year was that? And how long did that take? And what did you do your PhD? And what was your doctorate? And where did you do?" Okay, I'm going to explain that. This is probably the first time I've ever explained it ever in my life to anybody, but here it goes. So after going back to Springfield after getting out of the military, as you heard last time, I was doing all my vegetarian stuff and got involved in these strange groups, which kept me from my intention, which was to leave the military and take my stacks of books and go to this Trappist monastery, a Cistercian strict observance order called the Trappists, which basically are hermits. They don't talk. And in the old days, they literally did not talk. Only a few of them in the monastery would talk at all. The only time that words came out of your mouth, they were sacred words, doing the 5 offices of the day, and also the Holy Eucharist. And as I mentioned before, Father William had taken me down to this monastery, and that's the reason I knew about it. And upon thinking about it in the last few weeks, I realized, oh yeah, now I remember why he took me down there. He took me down there because it is out in the middle of nowhere in the Ozarks, and it is a very holy, sacred place. They consider it to be because these, monks are there who are totally dedicated to God every single second of their day. So that people down there, when you have someone who you think is possessed or has some serious spiritual problem, you take them to one of these places, and then they will talk to the abbot or whoever, the priest in charge. But those priests didn't do exorcisms in the day. They couldn't determine that. So Father William and I a couple times went down there, and we also built in a retreat. It's a retreat house, and anyone can schedule to go there on a retreat. And basically, you have these grounds. Assumption Abbey, or Our Lady of Assumption Abbey, it's got 2 different names. They usually call it Assumption Abbey, is an amazing place given to the Catholic Church, to the Trappists in Iowa, by a man named Joe Pearson, who was a Chicago newspaper owner and journalist. And he became very rich. So he bought 3,500 acres down in the Ozarks. Really beautiful place on a National Scenic Waterways river called Bryant Creek. And he and his sons and his wife built a kind of a English manor house, and a cross between that and a Swiss hunting chalet. I mean, it was a beautiful building, and that's where the monks initially lived. So when he gave it to the church, he said, okay, I want this to be for Trappists, but I want you to make a promise that whoever comes here, you will help them out, no matter how dire their situation was, right? That's not what the Trappists do. That's the opposite of what the Trappists do, right? So it was really kind of doomed to fail, and now it literally has failed. I just read last night or the night before that the American priests handed it over to Korean priests. They actually invited them to come and take over the place. And so in the end, it was given to the church, and now the church is giving it to some Korean Trappists or Cistercians who are not of the strict observance order. Now, the reason I liked it is because it was of the strict observance order, which means that, like my aunt, who had become a Carmelite nun, or what they call the Pink Sisters, who, as far as I knew, she was the closest thing to a saint I'd ever encountered. Every time I'd visit her, she never came out. When she went in, she never came out. They literally, unless they were moving from one monastery convent to another, they didn't come out. And she was the music director and the director of formation. She was an angel, literally. Every time I talked to her, I'd go to visit her, and she always looked like she was, 18 years old, though she was like, I think she lived well into her 90s, and sang. You could attend their service, but you couldn't go in. You could be on the outside. Well, at Ava, the Trappists, you went into their little tiny humble chapel, and you could sit there in the benches, and then they stood up next, kind of like at podiums, and it had the most humble altar, the most humble church I think you could ever imagine, where there was a real priest doing mass. And it was sacred to me because when I first went there, not only was I in love with nature myself, and this was one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen in Missouri, but the place, just the whole concept that you could go to a place where 4 hours a day you worked. And in those days, the work, when I knew it, was we made cement blocks. We'd go down to the Bryant Creek, take out the gravel, and mix it all up and make cement blocks and stack them up and sell them. That's the way the monastery made its living. That, and we had huge vineyards that we made wine jelly out of. And so we sold Trappist wine jelly, can you imagine? As well as we made nice wine. But when they first went there and they lived in the chalet, the reason I'm telling you this is because the chalet was probably the most haunted place I've ever been in my entire life. And I ended up living there. And it was, even to me, terrifying. I'm going to explain it how bad it was in a minute. And I thought for a while it was just me because I couldn't live up at the new monastery because the guy they put me in the room next to, I knew, and this is horrible. I'm sorry to have to say this, but I found it in the news last night or tonight or 2 nights before, whatever. As I knew, and I assumed that the head of the monastery, whose name was Father Cyprian, I assumed Father Cyprian knew this. The guy he put me in the room next to had raped and murdered a girl. And the only reason he came to the Catholic Church was to escape prosecution. Now, there were three types of monks there, and some were priests. I was already ordained as a priest, and so they didn't know what to do with me. They kind of let me do whatever I wanted. But soon I realized, after I was there a very short while, that I got a murderer to the right of me, a rapist to the left of me, a pedophile across the hall, and it's like, and then some of these other people who literally couldn't make it in the world if they had to. So they retreated to this, and it was going to be their life for the rest of their life, and that was fine with them. Now they did work, and now they make fruitcakes. They didn't make fruitcakes in my day, but now they make 30,000 fruitcakes a year, and they make the money to run this place, right? And they also gave away a big chunk of the land to this Franciscan group and another chunk of the land to the only, well, I've heard there's others. There probably is. I didn't look this up. In my day, there was only one place that a woman could be a hermit in the Catholic Church in America, and it was on that property. And they had these little houses that were built for them, and these nuns would create beautiful illuminated cards for holidays with beautiful, scripture passages in them, right? They were absolutely beautiful, and with flowers they'd pick from nature and all these beautiful things. So every once in a while they'd send me out to collect what they had put out in a basket and to deliver their food for the week. And these women, I never saw them, never once ever saw them outside of their little hut. And it was so out in the wilderness that you literally wouldn't have been able to find this place if you even knew where it was. You had to know the woods so well. Never did I see them out. So they were on the property, and there was also a place for men who were either leaving there because they decided that they weren't going to stay, or they were trying to come there, but they had to go through kind of a probation period, and they had to essentially make sure that they really wanted to do this. So they'd have to go to the 5 services in Mass a day and do the life, but not wear the robes and not take the vow yet. Well, for me, they didn't care. I'd already taken the vow. They let me put on the robes. They let me do whatever I wanted. And on this property was also a house, there were a couple halfway houses, but one of the halfway houses was for prostitutes who would call up the church and say, I need to get away from my pimp, and can someone come save me? All right. Well, this house would usually have about a dozen. It was a huge, big old house. It had about a dozen of these women in this halfway house, and the Franciscans tended to it. So there was a lot going on there, but the old chalet had been the old monastery. And so when they got the place in 1950, and it was a beautiful place. I mean, I loved every inch of that property, all 3,580 acres of it. And I knew all the caves, and I loved Bryant Creek, but I loved the chalet. Now the chalet had extensions built onto it as soon as the monks got it in 1950 when they came for Iowa. And so they built for years these big extensions and a better chapel. Well, when they built the new monastery, they decided they were going to take the old chalet back to exactly the way it was. So they had knocked it down. So the monks built it and they knocked it down, right? Eventually. So I go there, and here I am, it looks like I'm in prison or something with some, literally, this is now in the paper that one of the monks that this murderer confessed to told Father Cyprian, and Father Cyprian turned him in, and he ran away, but they finally caught this monk, and I believe they prosecuted him. But the point is, this is what the Catholic Church does, and I was being part of it. I said, I don't want to be in the world. I want to be as far away from the world as I can possibly be. I don't like the machines. I don't like the lies. I don't like the violence. I don't like any of that. I just want to study and write and just do spiritual practice. But the problem is the Catholic Church has become sacramentalism devoid of the sacred, except in certain cases. Father William, who trained me, he was like a saint to everyone. Father Cyprian, who was the abbot of Assumption Abbey, he was like a saint. He was just a beautiful soul. So I said to him after being there a very short while, I can't stay up here in this building. Do you mind if I stay down at the old monastery? And he says, fine, go down there. There was one guy, kind of a half monk, half not, and he was the maintenance kind of guy, and he had a building down in that area. Now, let me describe this chalet. It had its own water wheel. It had a spring coming out of the mountain. It was 3 stories tall, and then there was a room for the Father Superior up at the top. That was my room. So I liked that room because you could look out and see literally a Nixie. You could see a Nixie, a sylph. It's a mix of a sylph and an undine coming out of the spring, because the spring came right out of the mountain. You could see it coming down, and right there, day and night, if you had the ability to see it, she was always there. So I could look out this window from the Father Superior's room and just think, oh, this is cool. And then there was these gigantic barns they had where they everything they needed to run the place. At one point they raised sheep. They tried to raise food, but the Ozarks are terrible for ground for raising things. So it was a bad place for that. But they had built like a 75-yard long expansion walking bridge, I guess you'd call it. It went from a cliff over the river all the way to the top above the floodplains, and that's where that halfway house was. So you could walk there, and that's how we also got to the cinder block factory. And so this place was totally, absolutely magical. But the problem was it was fantastically haunted, because the very monks who you would think were the holy, sacred men who don't speak because they're so in direct contact with God, no, that is not what's happening. At least a third to a half of them were horrible people before they turned to that. So because they didn't get to speak, and because they didn't ever share it with their father confessor, they carried those sins in them for all those years under the hypocritical aura of just not being honest to begin with. And so then they're involved in all this sacred spiritual stuff 5 times a day, and really they're kind of doing the opposite. So I moved there, and then I moved from the top floor down to the bottom so I could get some heat and whatever. I'm in this room, and every night, right after sundown, you start hearing people walking through it, people working, no one ever speaking. And then pretty soon it would get louder and louder. And pretty soon the only thing I could figure out is that they were tearing down the building. That's what it sounded like, tearing down the building outside of the room. And it was scary, because it would also come and turn the handle on my door, try to get into the door and all this stuff. And so I locked the door. But I thought for a while I was just insane. So I invited one of these people in the halfway house to come down and witness this. And he says, oh no, absolutely. So I moved out to the caves. And most of the time I spent in the cave, sleeping on a cot and doing my work at the mouth of the cave.
Did you have any kind of poltergeist activity around there? Or
Absolutely.
Apparitions?
No apparitions. It was scary because all that noise, and you couldn't hear a person speak because they didn't speak, right? So I'm literally just I'm here trying to read Steiner and trying to read all these other things, and it was just absolutely terrifying. So I just moved out to the cave. Now the caves they advertise, yeah, that's not the cave I was in. The cave I was in, you had to climb over a fence and run across to another fence and climb over that fence to get to the mouth of the cave, because the fence actually went up against the mountain and you couldn't. So no matter what, you had to go through where the big bull lived. And this bull had huge horns, and this bull would attack me every freaking time I'd go to that cave or try to get out of the cave, right? So I would have to just, as fast as I could, go over to that cave. But I thought, this is great. I got a bull protecting me. Nobody's, except the farmer, nobody's going to come bother me in this cave because of this bull. I can barely get in here, right? And so I'd take my food out there and I'd stay out there as long as I could, and I'd fast and I'd meditate. And then one day it came about that I had this vision. And so, yes, I did have a vision. And the vision was, I wrote it down, and it was in a cave. And it said that for 30 days, I wanted to go without eating, in absolute silence, meditating on the life of Christ. Okay, I wrote that down. But then right after that, I want to work with children. I want to work in the maternity ward of a hospital, and I want to work in a hospice so I would know what birth and death was. And then I wanted to work with hydrocephalic children and microcephalic children so I'd see the extreme between human beings, right? And then I wanted to get a PhD in philosophy, but got geared towards religion and comparative religions. And then I wanted to get my doctorate of divinity because I was already ordained, so I didn't have to get ordained again. So, but ordination would have been in there. And then I wanted to be a parish priest, and then I wanted to come back to a university and be a teacher. So anyway, I tell Father Cyprian this plan, and he goes, "Well, you can't stay here any longer." And I said, "Why is that?" He says, "How do you know about the Jesuits?" I said, "What's a Jesuit?" And he says, "You don't know about the Jesuits?" No. Well, how do you know their secret training plan, their 15-year secret training plan in the exact order, which Ignatius of Loyola, their founder, arrived at being in a cave in solitude? How do you know that there's 30 days of silence and what to meditate on? Surely you got that from his the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola called the Manresa. And I said, "I don't know anything that you're talking about." Then he goes, "Then absolutely, you can't stay here anymore. You have to go up to Rockhurst College, and now it's university. You're going to become a Jesuit." And I said, "Really? Don't send me up there. I don't want to become a Jesuit." He goes, "That plan you have, that is exactly what they're going to do for you. They're going to accomplish every single one of those things."
Yeah, we have a plan for you. Yes, well, it's no mystery to some of our viewers, many of our viewers out there, that we are quite aware of the machinations of the Jesuit order that was started by Ignatius of Loyola, the Soldiers of Christ. And there's a long history, and I don't really want to go too far with a lot of what we could be talking about, because Douglas is presenting his personal story here. And so, but I'd like to bring up, though, I couldn't do this episode without mentioning one particular individual that's very interesting to me in that regard, and that's Charles Chiniquy. And he was a former Catholic priest from Canada, but he converted out of the Catholic Church and became a Presbyterian evangelical minister. But he went through a lawsuit when he was living in the city of Chicago, and the individual that ended up representing him in court was Abraham Lincoln. And so they maintained a correspondence over the years, and Charles Chiniquy ended up writing Abraham Lincoln and the Jesuits in 1886. And he starts off with, "The Pope of Rome and his Jesuits know this better than anyone, hence their constant and supreme efforts to destroy this republic." And so we'll make reference to that during the course of the conversation, because it I'm sure will fit in very neatly into some of the ideas that Douglas is going to share about his personal experience.
Oh, yes. The Jesuits are infamous. They are nefarious. And let me just explain one of the ways they work. They have two Jesuit experts in every field, including black magic, including paganism, including anthroposophy, including anything you can possibly name. Science, archaeology, you name it. And for a long time, about a third of the Jesuits did whatever they wanted to do. They were allowed to go out, be explorers, to be inventors, to do whatever. So they're really an amazing cadre of brilliant men, but they have a big doppelganger. When I was forced to go to Rockhurst College, they were told, because Father Cyprian knew all about me and he knew Father William. So they were told, this is a young man who was given ordination, extraordinary ordination at age 14, who studied for 4 years as a study with the man who was the head of formation and the largest house of formation in America, and what's called the minor monastery, or the minor studies. And then there's major studies. They don't call it that. They just call that the seminary. And so you have kind of like what's a BA degree and an MA degree. Each take about 2 years. So I went through 4 years of training. So as far as the Catholic Church was concerned, I already had a BA and an MA. I already had an associate's degree from the university in computers before I graduated high school. And then I got an associate's degree when I was in the NSA with broadcasting. So literally it was a degree that could get you, turn you into a broadcaster, as it were, in terms of the technology. So I had these degrees, and they looked at my record and said, well, then you just need straight to move on, because we need your expertise. We're going to make you the junior understudy of the two people who study anthroposophy in the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus. I'm like, what? You do that? I've had to kind of keep that under wraps, And they said, no, absolutely. And then they led me to a room. Now, every Jesuit university that has a house of formation, has the house of formation usually called Jesuit House, and they have another one for the Jesuits. Well, in that house for the Jesuits, they have a fantastic library. And in that library, they'll open a door, and behind it is like a jail door, bars, and it's locked. And so every place that I went, they'd go, no, you're allowed in here. And they'd give me the key. They'd allow me in there. And I would go in there, and here's all of Steiner's books. Here's Blavatsky's books. Here's Athanasius Kirchner. Here's all the stuff they wouldn't let anybody else read. But they let me read it because I had been chosen to be an understudy of a Jesuit who was an anthroposophist. And they love to have experts in these areas. So most of the Jesuits hated me before they even saw me. Okay. And then when it happened in every place I was at, some priest or the other would try to sexually manhandle me. I had 2 black belts, and I had studied in the military, all these things. So I would tell them, if you ever put your hand on me again, I'm going to hurt you in a way that the pain won't stop for a long time. So they'd put their hand on me, so I'd grab them here, and I'd, hold this for a few seconds, and they'd be walking around with their hand like this for quite a while. And I would go and report the stupid guys because I didn't join a cult of homosexuality. That isn't why I was there, though I was clairvoyant. I knew a lot of them were that way. I just didn't know that the higher up you go, the more complicit you have to be and the more allowed it is. You can go to any major city now and plug in priests who pedophiles, right? And they will give you a list. Last one I looked at was in Pennsylvania, somewhere in Pennsylvania. 158 priests charged with over 600 crimes of sexual assault to usually little boys and little girls. It is rampant. And as you know, they paid $4.5 million for these lawsuits not too long ago, but they haven't paid a penny since. So I'm there, and they hated me. So my first degree, they said, well, we have to get you your PhD. And since you've done all this study, they have a Jesuit house. In the Jesuit house, you can earn a PhD in months, as long as that's all you're focused on. And if your committee accepts your thesis, and you don't do statistics. So I did one I stole from Rudolf Steiner. I did one on the connection between Aristotle's 10 categories, Dionysius the Areopagite, and the angelology of Thomas Aquinas. Knowing that Rudolf Steiner had been Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, how could I go wrong? And boom, it was like, whoa, shock to them. They're like, oh my, that's good. Here, bing, bango, get the heck out of here. We're sending you to a house of formation at Regis University in Denver, Colorado, to do your second PhD and to get your Doctor of Divinity. And I'm like, okay, fine. So I went there. That place was it was grotesque. it was a house of formation, right? And it was one of the largest houses of formations for the Jesuits. So every Wednesday and Saturday, they brought the nuns over from the convents who were in formation to see if any of the boys liked the girls. And if they were out. They were gone. They literally gave them rooms. There were rooms on that floor that had empty rooms with the doors unlocked with beds in them. They promoted sexual interaction between the nuns and the Jesuit priests. Why? To make sure that they weren't going to like females, because Jesuits don't like females.
But yeah, that it brings to mind Aldous Huxley's book, The Devils of Loudun, and where they had these subterranean cavernous underground tunnels between the men's quarters and the quarters of the nuns. And it's also where they had like the crypt with the offspring of that union, so to speak. So that this is something that the church doesn't stop things, it obfuscates them. It's kind of like what happens we see in the political world. And so it's interesting because, again, returning to Charles Chiniquy, the gentleman I told you about who converted to Protestant, mind you, to understand the mindset of the Catholic Church, they'd rather make a treaty with another religion than with a Protestant. Because with a Protestant, there's always a temptation that somebody could convert to Protestantism, but still be Christian. And so that was a bigger threat than if somebody was like Muslim or Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist or anything like that. So that their basic target, as far as that which they wished to stop, it was Protestantism. And most people, they don't really know anything about, church history and all these kinds of things. But what Abraham Lincoln said to Charles Chiniquy toward the end of his life, while he was president, he said, "I will repeat to you what I said at Urbana, when for the first time you told me your fears lest I would be assassinated by the Jesuits. Man must not care where and when he will die, provided he dies at the post of honor and duty. But I may add today that I have a presentiment that God will call me to him through the hand of an assassin. Let his will and not mine be done." He then looked at his watch and said, "I'm sorry that the 20 minutes I consecrated to our interview has almost passed away. I'll be forever grateful for the warning words you've addressed to me about the dangers ahead of my life from Rome. I know they are not imaginary dangers. If I were fighting against a Protestant South as a nation, there would be no danger of assassination. The nations who read the Bible fight bravely on the battlefields, but they do not assassinate their enemies. The Pope and the Jesuits, with their infernal Inquisition, are the only organized power in the world which have recourse to the dagger of the assassin to murder those whom they cannot convince with their arguments or conquer with the sword." And he goes on from there, but I mean that's like pretty clear the seriousness of the way in which they take themselves in this order.
Boy, that's for sure. And Blavatsky said something to the effect of, not all black magicians are Jesuits, just the good ones. And what she meant by that is, Athanasius Kirchner, I read Athanasius Kirchner thinking he's the greatest Christian occultist, and then I find out he's a Jesuit. And a lot of times, S.J. behind the name, be wary, Society of Jesus. And essentially, the old vow of the Jesuit priest, when they got ordained, pre-forgave them for even murder. It goes down the list of what they're all pre-forgiven for because they're doing it as the soldiers of the Pope. They are the Pope's black army because they wore all black usually, or called black robes even. And they went everywhere and they conquered everything. It used to be said that when the Pope was ready to go to war with a certain nation, he would start to gather the money and the troops and all that he would need. But first, the very first thing he'd do is he'd send 2 Jesuits there. And the joke is that by the time he reaches the gate of the city that he needs to conquer, the Jesuits come out with the keys to the city because they had gone in and started educating the rulers, the monarch, whoever it was, and they took over education. That's why they have dozens of universities in America and all over the world, many others. And they are a ruthless cadre of intellectuals who are pretty much the coldest priests you'll ever meet. They generally do not have a warm heart. I've known Jesuits who had a dozen PhDs besides their DD and their and that they were, of course, ordained, but they didn't even believe in Jesus of Nazareth. They didn't think he was a real character. They didn't believe in Christ. They didn't feel it. They didn't have a conversion of anything. And when they would say mass, it was the deadest experience. I mean, a simple priest could say mass and literally bring down angels. These guys, no. So I did not like going to mass when I was at these Jesuit universities. Also, because usually one of the highest priests around conducted the mass. And as I said, the further up you go, the more complicit you are with this cult. So here I am in Denver, Colorado, at the Jesuit house, watching the depredation of the Catholic Church. And I'm becoming so incredibly discouraged. And I basically got kicked out of the monastery, more or less, got kicked out of the university and pushed over to another one. They didn't like me either. But they did allow me to stay there and work at the hospital. That same in Rockhurst, I worked in the hospital and I went to these places that are part of the Jesuit training. But I went on a really fast, accelerated path because they didn't like me, because I was all the time talking about Mother Mary and who says the rosary around here? How come we don't have Mary devotions? The Jesuits don't do the rosary. They don't do the Stations of the Cross. They're not mystics. They're not into that kind of thing, sacramentalism. Well, it was really bad in Denver, but I did get another PhD and got my doctorate of divinity there. So I got ordained there, and St. John's Chapel there, that's part of Regis University. And my second PhD was basically, what was the title? Something like Pre-Christian Beliefs in the Divine Trinity. Now, for them, they thought, oh, that's harmless enough. But once they read it and once they realized that I was correct, I went back to all of the religious documents in every traditional religion and pulled out, even from the Bible, clear descriptions. You cannot deny that the feminine is there at creation, period. And if you don't acknowledge that, then you basically are denying all of history. So they had to give me my PhD. They reluctantly gave me my doctorate of divinity and did a reordination kind of thing, lie on the floor, bless you with the bishop, blah, blah. And then they got rid of me and they shipped me off to St. Louis University to be it was my parish training, right? So St. Louis University, I didn't do any more study, but I was there at the Jesuit house as a Jesuit, as an ordained Jesuit. And so I went into the music thing because I'd already done a lot of music and loved these Pentecostal songs, spirit-filled songs. And they were real radical at that time. It was the first time guitars were ever brought into a Catholic service, was in St. Louis University at this fantastic cathedral they have there. And so I joined the choir and played guitar and sang songs and da-da-da. And then, of course, what happens? One priest after the next comes and tries to assault me. And I don't mean it's like they come up and say, hi, do you like guys? No, this is an assault. It's an assault and battery because they put their hands on you. And I kept hurting these priests. I would warn them because I could see their thought as they're walking up to me. And you don't want to do that with me. You will walk away with a pain that you will not forget for a very long time. So I just tell them this, right? Still did it. No problem. So I caused so much trouble there turning these people in that they said, okay, time for you to now go and study with the understudy of the main Jesuit who does anthroposophy. We can't hook you up with him yet because he's a psychologist who's very famous. And he went out there to blast Rudolf Steiner. So wrote a book about the head Jesuit that's studying anthroposophy. He wrote a book bashing Rudolf Steiner. And it sold a few copies, but he had gone into anthroposophy and he found really nothing there of any merit. Well, that wasn't the way it was for me. I said, no, 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 no. I had money still left over from what we're going to talk about in our next talk. The fact that I sold crystals all the time. Anywhere I went, I had a van, I had my own van, and the Jesuits hated the fact that I had money. I had my own transportation, and I could just say, I'm out of here because they thought that, well, look, we have very few trained clairvoyants who have been trained as an exorcist. And we sometimes need this, for publicity's sake. Why? Because they were probably causing the possessions, these priests. So they kept me around because they'd always call me into whatever. There was something weird, some horrible, weird thing going on when the Catholic Church would be asked to participate. And so early on, even when I was at Rockhurst, um, I could go into many situations. I helped the police. I helped find missing bodies. Blah 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 blah. But the point is, they thought that I was a useful person to some degree, but they hated my philosophy. They hated that I was focused on the feminine, and that there was a Trinity before the Father, Son, Holy Ghost. There was the Mother, Daughter, Holy Sophia, and they just hated that. So they wanted to just keep pushing me on. So they basically said, look, here's what you can do. We're going to put you on this stipend, and you're going to go out there in the world, and you're going to go to all these anthroposophic places and see what good you can derive from it. I said, oh, there's tremendous good in Waldorf education that you can put in your parochial schools. Steiner's Christology is the most profound there is. And so I said, yes, I would be happy to do that. So I got free reign at that point to start traveling about to study anthroposophy. Now, I was honest everywhere I went. I would say to them, I'm a Jesuit associate. Normally, that would turn off any anthroposophist and they wouldn't talk to me. But it's okay. I always told whoever the boss was in any of these places I went, if they ask me, who are you? How did you get here? And why do you know what I'm thinking? And I tell them, blah, blah, blah. And I'm here to see if we can glean some good out of anthroposophy for the Catholic Church. In my mind, I wanted to change the Catholic Church, and I thought I was going to reform it. That was probably one of the most naive thoughts I ever had. So I started on this path of being a Jesuit and entering into these anthroposophic communities.
Well, along those lines, I remember when we were at the Institute that the Vatican sent the Curia to Dornach to meet with the Vorstand, with the executive committee of the Anthroposophical Society. And it was like kind of disarming to the people like that. But I heard about that from Hage Besants, who was head of the society at the time when he was here. And so they were kind of wondering, because they didn't make the inquiry. They weren't asking, hey, you want to come check this out? They just kind of showed up, which is a little intimidating because there's really a broad range of opinions regarding the Jesuits. I mean, Rudolf Steiner's troubles basically began after he gave the lecture cycle From Jesus to Christ, where he compared the Jesuits to the Rosicrucian stream. And the Jesuit was this strong militaristic emphasis on the Jesus principle, whereas the Rosicrucian impulse was the careful preservation of the mysteries of the Logos, of the Christ being, the supersensible being that is I am the way, the truth, and the life, as he says, And so that's a little bit different than I'm a soldier in the army of the Pope.
That's right. And that you're hoping for the second coming to be what the Jesuits put in their special exercises called Manresa, where they say Jesus is coming back on a white horse with a sword, and he's going to take over the whole world. That's what the Jesuits believe. They also believe in liberation theology, which I call chaos Marxism. And they believe in apocalyptic theology. They actually believe the apocalypse must happen before Jesus will return. They don't understand. Jesus has already returned. He's in the etheric realm for those who have eyes to see. But you hit it right on the head. I forgot to mention one of the most important things. How could I have gone through a Jesuit training and not turned out to be a Jesuit? Well, you mentioned what is the antidote? He gave a series of lectures, which was the antithesis of what are called the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, created in Manresa. So they just shorten it to Manresa. And today, right now, you can go to any Catholic retreat place, especially Jesuit sponsored, and they'll put you through the same exact meditations. But the problem is you're not going to get the full whammy. The full whammy is you have to be in a room alone that you do not come out of, that you do not speak to a single person, and you go through these 4-week meditations, a week on each of these things: sin and mercy, then the life of Christ in three levels, and then basically the part they extract and they don't show anybody is Jesus returning, the second coming of Christ, according to the Jesuits, which is the worst spiritual materialism you can possibly have. Jesus is not going to come in. He came in on a donkey. He didn't have a sword, and he didn't come to conquer the world, even though he did say he came to bring a sword to separate father from son, mother from daughter. But that's a spiritual thing. He did not come to conquer the world. The Jesuits are here to conquer the world. In around 1540 or whatever it was, Ignatius of Loyola got his leg blown up in a war, basically trying to move back to Jerusalem, and he got exposed a lot to the Muslim faith and also to the Jewish faith, and he basically mixed the two together, the worst parts of both, jihad and pogrom, mixed together, given to the Pope. Ignatius literally said, "Let me go out and kill everybody who doesn't convert to Catholicism." That was his true impulse, okay? And I know that's a horrible, quick version of it, but that is the bottom line. The Jesuits are pre-forgiven for murder. So they're the experts in poisoning.
Oh, it's even, if you talk about the fourth vow of the Jesuits, you don't see it around much, but it's the deepest level of, it's like in the intelligence community where they have the undisclosed secret access program, and so you have USAP. But the USAP for the Jesuits is that it's a sin to allow a Protestant to live. That's essentially,
go figure.
They're operative.
Oh yeah, I mean, Jesuits have been behind most wars. I'll just put it that way. Most wars in Europe and America, and throughout the world, there are still Jesuit influences. They're kind of like the CIA, which is British founded CIA in America. That they're the Vatican CIA. They're the Vatican exterminators. They're assassins. They literally have poisoned so many people. It's ridiculous. They've poisoned popes that they didn't like if the Pope wasn't in their inclined towards them. And they're kind of like Babylonian Radhanite bankers. They've been kicked out of every single European country over and over again. Same thing with the Jesuits. The Jesuits were kicked out of this, kicked out of that. They were always seen for their machinations. And as John has pointed out, there have been books, many books written on it. So anthroposophists, because so many of them don't really do their homework, they're terrified of Jesuits. I remember when the leader of our first class group here in this area came up to me and said, "Douglas, may I," you know who I'm talking about, John, "Douglas, may I ask you a personal question?" And I'd say, "Well, of course you can ask me a personal question. What is it?" "Are you really a Jesuit?" Because I was like the leader of the school, and I was Werner's protege, and I'm on the speakers bureau. And so I was a representative of anthroposophy all over the world. And she comes up and asks, finally, after knowing me for like 25 years, "Are you really a Jesuit?" I told Werner I was a Jesuit when I first passed through Detroit the very first time. That was when I helped him open the bookstore when they had moved into the Kearney building. And that was when he said to me, he trusted me so much that many of you have heard this story. I'm setting up the bookstore, and he calls me, or he sticks his head in and says, "Someone's on line 1 I want you to help them. And it was Kathleen Kennedy. And we talked about this last time. I told her about Steiner-centered, all these books. She never told me her name. Poltergeist was written based upon Steiner's work. Later, she contacted me when I was working at the Mayflower, where you were the manager for so many years. And then for years had this relationship with her that created the Indiana Jones movies, right? Well, that kind of moment was after I told Werner point blank, you might not want me to go here. I'm a Jesuit associate. And he was shocked. And then he asked the details, and I told him the details. And he says, no, that's fine. You're honest. I can tell you're an honest person, and da da da. And since you're really into books and you know more about the English versions of all these Steiner books, will you please go start me a bookstore? So I started working for him before I ever came there. But when I did come there, and I came back to Detroit years afterwards, I stayed at the Jesuit house until my father confessor tried to put his hands on me repeatedly. Okay? So he's probably still walking around with a crippled hand too, but that's fine. I hope he does. And so I had to leave there. And so then I moved downtown. But the point is, anywhere that you go, the Jesuits they terrify anthroposophists. And some will even say, if you are someone like Valentine Tomberg, or you're a Robert Powell, they'll accuse them of being Jesuits because, yes, to some degree, they absorb certain Catholic ideas. And matter of fact, Tomberg went back to the Catholic Church at the end of his life, and then I think he dumped it at the very end of his life. I can't remember. But here are these people who will skirt around with anthroposophy, and then they'll go wholesale into Catholicism. Matter of fact, I could name a dozen writers who that has happened to. So Catholicism it has tremendously bad karma. Think of all the witches they burnt. Those weren't witches. Those were women with property whose husbands had died, and they killed them so they could have their property. This is well known. We don't know how many millions. How many millions of Protestants were killed? In the Counter-Reformation, which was led by the Jesuits, how many Unity Brethren were killed? Waldensians. And earlier than that, of course, you have Thomas Aquinas writing, what was it called? Against the Heretics. And that's the translation from Latin. And it was used to go kill Cathars, Albigensians, Bogomils, Waldensians, you name it. They just murdered all these people in crusades right in Europe. People don't know this, all led by the Jesuits, using Thomas Aquinas as their justification. What did they call him? The Doctor of Angels, or he was supposedly, and he was a great, great saint, no doubt.
Yes, Dr. Angelicus. Well, everybody who's any kind of student of history is well aware of the rough history of the church, but there's really an important critical point to which Douglas's experience and really our relationship to the modern world spins in relation to the Jesuits, and that has to do with the Council of Trent. And because it was at the Council of Trent that the international visage of the church was presented as a basis of international law. And so that's the directive that one is working under once one has applied themselves to be a part of the body of the church, so that if you weren't a part of that, then you're going against this international treaty that was established. Because there were I think 4 sessions of the Council of Trent, but it was at the last 2 that the Jesuits inserted themselves and finalized the document. It wouldn't surprise me if they had a hand in the Patriot Act. I mean, we know that Joe Biden was one of the authors of the Patriot Act, and he's coming out of the Catholic milieu, as you know. So there's this whole challenge because, like, for example, if you go back to JFK and you start looking up the people that are involved basically under Cardinal Spellman, and you see that these people to a man and woman, Knights of Malta. Okay, I mean, go down the whole list. It's a Knights of Malta operation, and so you have this kind of murky liaison between the OSS, which became the CIA, and its relationship to Georgetown University. There was a Jesuit university. Carroll Quigley was a professor of history at Georgetown University, and he was a mentor of Bill Clinton. And then you go with it's the crossbreeding with Harvard University, which is a very strong Catholic presence, and also the relationship to Yale with the Skull and Bones. And so it's all this architecture of the United States is like very complex. And so it's in light of that you have to understand Douglas's adventures here, because it's an established reality amongst people that are true students of history.
And the Jesuits are in control of the Vatican Knights of Malta, and then the British copied it through the House of Savoy, deriving from the Merovingian fake lineage, that you actually believe, some of them believe that they have the bloodline of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. Exactly. That's the British Knights of Malta. So there is still to this day, and the House of Savoy they're involved in what's called the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre, which is a secret order that basically protects supposedly the bloodline of Jesus. It's been called, the Priory of Zion and other bogus names, but it's just simply they're there, the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre. And they were basically in direct odds with the Jesuits, who took over the Knights of Malta and brought it into the modern age with the Vatican Bank and so on and so forth. So to this very day, we are still revealing the secrets that are behind this, that have been turned into the British version of it. And so when I want to point out this other thing, the Jesuit senior student of anthroposophy was named Ahern, Jeffrey Ahern, and he wrote a book on Rudolf Steiner where he said Rudolf Steiner and all of his followers have a father complex, and they only believe because they need to surrender themselves to a mean and dominating father. I hated that guy. He was so off on Rudolf Steiner that he couldn't have been any further off. And what he was saying is, oh, all you pathetic little cult followers, you are undeveloped, you're hypocrites, and you just need to have a daddy. And Rudolf Steiner's a perfect daddy because he's dead. And that's what his book says. This is the expert in anthroposophy. And then the second expert in anthroposophy, his student, who was much older than I've mentioned this in other matter of fact, I've written about some of these things. One of the titles is, Are there Jesuit spies in the Anthroposophic Society? Well, there's plenty of them. And one of them literally was the second guy who studied Steiner underneath Ahern. And I won't say his name. He's still alive. Oh, but he did the same thing I did once I did it, which was when I went through the Jesuit Manresa, I used the From Jesus to Christ as the antidote. And I had a Christian community priest work with me beforehand so that I would not do any of the materialistic meditations that they gave, but I would follow Rudolf Steiner's path of understanding the missing years of Jesus and what the life of Jesus was all about. But this guy, who was basically I was his understudy, right? And so I went to their headquarters in Spring Valley, New York, to Hungry Hollow, and he ran the place. So the Jesuit ran the largest anthroposophic community in America for years and years and years. You couldn't get in without his approval. He was a genius. He knew just about anything you could know intellectually about anthroposophy, but he had no heart, and he actually thought that he was channeling Rudolf Steiner. That's how skewed some of the Jesuits get.
Yeah, people are so preoccupied with so many dramas that are going on today. And the one drama that's really slipping under the radar is the border crisis is here and in Europe. And that the refugee program is being run by the Jesuits of the Vatican. And so that they've always striven to increase the population that adheres to their denomination. And that's important to understand, is that in countries where they were in a minority, they would fight for freedom of speech and all that. As soon as they gained the majority, they shut it all down. And that's their basic modus operandi. And so I can see we've got some more interesting adventures involving this leg of the story in the future, but we are since running out of time for this particular episode. But that just gives us something to look forward to and continue on in our the perils of Dr. Douglas Gabriel climbing the metaphysical ladder. And so it's wonderful to see you all again. And Douglas, I want to thank you so much. And God bless everyone in their endeavors.
Thank you, John, especially for midwifing this cathartic experience.